Dr. Atchison here, and we are still on Chapter 4, Recognizing Visual Objects. We're on the home stretch, so this is our last video, video 4, Object Recognition and Top-Down Processing. So for object recognition, the visual system may recognize an object as being the same despite the fact that the retinal image may be different. And this is called invariance. And there's two approaches to object recognition. The first is that there's a single representation that is activated when we see an object. And that all of these objects are represented the same way. Okay, so you see a cup, it's represented, there's one representation for all of the cups, and every time you see a cup, it's represented the exact same way. The other approach to object recognition is that objects are represented in a view-specific manner. So we can have as many different representations as there are ways of seeing them. So think back to our Brooklyn Bridge picture. When we had all those different views of the Brooklyn Bridge, the variable views, that those would be represented in every specific way that it could be viewed. So we have a LaunchPad exercise that will walk us through shape representation in area V4 and beyond. And so it talks about information in V4, it talks about the IT Cortex, and it will walk you through kind of this hierarchy about complexity of stimuli. So do that, again, for a grade. Okay, so in object recognition, one of the ideas is that there's something called a grandmother cell. And the idea is, the way it got its name is that this cell would respond to your grandmother's face. When your brain would respond to your grandmother's face, this neuron in your brain would respond to your grandmother's face regardless of kind of how your grandmother's face is presented. If you see a picture, if you just hear her name, if you see her face to face, if you see her from far, if you see her close up, that this one neuron would fire. It's this idea that cells are so tuned that they can respond to a particular object. The problem with that is, think of how many objects there are out there for us to represent in our cortex. There's too many cells, and it would require to be able to recognize the huge number of different recognizable objects. So there's a back and forth of, do grandmother cells really exist? This idea was first brought forth in the 60s, but there's been some more recent support for it as well. So they were studying epilepsy patients, and they were doing single neuron recordings, like we've talked about before, where there's one neuron being recorded. And again, we were only able to do these kinds of studies because they were already in their brain. So they weren't going into their brain specifically to do single cell recordings, but this is with, hey, we've got your brain open. Can we just test this? So they were testing epilepsy patients. And when they were they found in one situation, a neuron responded to a picture of the Sydney Opera House, and that exact same neuron responded to the words Sydney Opera House, which really supported the idea that there may be grandmother cells. And this was done much more recently in 2005. So it's an ongoing theory that's being tested and that has some support. And it may be that we have these grandmother cells for certain kinds of objects, but not others. So the conclusion is that really neurons throughout the visual hierarchy contribute to object recognition, that there may be some specific cells that are involved, like we saw with the Sydney Opera House, but it really is not just one cell that's responsible for the whole object recognition, that it really is neurons throughout this hierarchy that are involved. And that neurons in V1 and V2 are really providing really detailed information about precise locations of edges, whereas the neurons in V4 are giving us information about curvature and orientation and contours, which is all stuff that you went through in that LaunchPad exercise. And the neurons in the IT cortex are giving us that information about complex shape. And those highest level neurons will give us this representation of the concept. And that representation is that idea that it's not changing. It's that same representation. It's invariant. It's not changing regardless of the presentation of that representation will be the same. So it's again this hierarchy that V1 and V2 are giving us information about edges, V4 is giving us information about curvature and orientation, and then those IT cortex is giving us information about these complex representations. So there's various ways in which we think that these representations are being done. And again, there's a LaunchPad exercise that will help you walk through this. It's specifically talking about the difference between modular coding versus distributed coding. So modular coding is the idea that these things are really only being represented in these specialized brain areas that we talked about, like the fusiform face area and the parahippocampal place area. And these specific areas are where the bulk of the work's being done. Whereas distributed coding is saying that this representation is happening across many regions of the brain. And hopefully what you get from the LaunchPad exercise is that both are really involved, that the visual system is representing objects in both modular coding and distributed coding. So again, we're going to walk you through this through the LaunchPad exercise. It's really going to focus on the fusiform face area, the parahippocampal place area, and the extrastriate body area. So those are the three areas that the LaunchPad exercise will focus on to kind of work you through this idea of both modularity in coding and distribution in coding. So we do know that there is a face-selective region, and we've talked about that in the previous chapter, in chapter 3, when we talked about the fusiform face area. We're showing you that again in that LaunchPad exercise. And here's a study, an fMRI experiment that used 30-second sequences of faces versus other types of objects. Here we have houses, objects, or scrambled faces. And they were shown to these human subjects. And what we saw is that, and there was faces versus objects, faces versus houses, and faces versus intact faces versus scrambled faces. So a scrambled face has all the features of the face, but they're just not in a face-like pattern. And what we typically see is that we don't get that same level of response because they're not seen as face-like. So it's kind of the sum of the parts is not the same, the whole is not equal to the sum of its parts, is that idea of what we're looking at scrambled faces versus intact faces. And in all of these, the fusiform gyrus was more activated when they were viewing faces. And again, this is where they got the term the fusiform face area. And these images here, the area that's marked in green is that IT cortex, that fusiform gyrus. And again, you see more activation with faces than they did with either objects or houses or even scrambled faces. So there is this idea that modularity is going on, and there are particular areas of the brain that really are focused on particular types of images. Because of this idea of modularity, because we have particular parts of the brain that are specific to different types of representations, this creates a situation where we can have damage to that specific module, and we can develop a kind of visual agnosia. There's different varieties. Visual form agnosia is the ability where we lose the ability to perceive shapes. And this is, again, usually from damage to relatively early parts of the ventral pathway. So all of these are along the ventral pathway, but this is going to be earlier on in the ventral pathway. This is not damage to the parahippocampal place area. This is not damage to the fusiform face area. This is earlier on in that ventral pathway, that what pathway. And there's a video that I've assigned for you to watch on visual form agnosia. Prosopagnosia is, again, that recognizing faces. And I know chapter 3 covered it some more. And again, there was a short video that talked a little bit about it as well. But it, again, is damage to that fusiform face area. And we see then an inability to recognize faces. This is also highly heritable. We can inherit prosopagnosia as well. It's not just brain damage. And then topographic agnosia, this is going to be damage to that parahippocampal place area. And again, this is going to impair one's ability to recognize buildings and spatial layouts and other kinds of spaces, other kinds of places. And so again, this is more evidence for this idea of modularity. When one area is damaged, we see impaired functioning to that area. Again, this is that idea of dissociation and double dissociation as well that we talked about earlier in the chapters. So this is involved in this modularity and in these diagnoses of visual agnosia. So this idea that we have these different modules are not just coming from brain studies where we've looked at activation. It's also coming from disordered studies where we look at damage and we look at see what kind of deficits occur through both dissociation and double dissociation. So up until this point, we've really talked about bottom-up processing. In chapters 2 and 3, we talked about literally from the bottom up, right? We talked about the spectrum of light. We talked about neurons. We talked about how that information, the brain pathways that gets into. We talked about the anatomy of the eye. We talked about modularity in chapter 3. Even in chapter 4, we've been focused on bottom up. We've taken, how do we organize these things? How do we figure out what's the figure versus the ground? How do we then group these things? And then how do we recognize these things? We've built it from the bottom up. But the context influences perception too. Take this image per se. When you look at this, you read the cat, okay? But when you really look at it, the H, in air quotes, and the A in air quotes are really the same image. But the context of those, the image of that kind of truncated A or that angled H, however you choose to view it, between the E and the T makes it look like an H. Whereas between the C and the T, it makes it look like an A. So again, that context really is influencing that process of perception. And that's really indicative that both bottom-up processing is going, but also top-down processing is going too. So top-down is that opposite direction. Instead of building it from sensation up, it's going to be thinking down. It's going to be taking what we know, our memory, these sorts of things, and going down. When you did that LaunchPad example about the fact of meaningfulness, on recognizing figure to ground ambiguity, that was top-down processing taking a role. Meaningfulness was saying that means something. That's top-down processing. Top-down processing is really emphasizing the goals and the attention and the knowledge and the expectations on perception. So our knowledge of how to read was that top-down information. Our expectations then that shape was an H and that shape was an A, even though they were the exact same shape. That context and our knowledge of reading changed our perception of them. It's not just top-down or bottom-up. Both of those things are working together. And we think that those things meet up in the ventral pathway. And this really is helpful to us because it speeds up the process. It's kind of meet in the middle. Instead of having to build the entire information from the bottom up or build the entire information stream from the top down, we'll go both directions and we'll meet in the middle. And we can speed this process up and we can recognize objects in a scene quicker. The brain is always actively predicting the future, what it's going to see, what it's going to need to see. And this is very adaptive for us. This is very, has a definite evolutionary benefit in our past. And it uses both the information from our recent past and the information from the current information that's around us. And unconsciously, we make an inference about what's going on. we're guessing kind of based on our past and based on the current situation, and taking those two things and meeting in the middle, again, on this top-down processing. Theories of top-down processing are really more conceptually driven, while bottom-up processing theories are data-driven. So this is why we've spent so much time talking about bottom-up theories, is because those are data-driven and we have a lot of data to back those up. Those are really easy to quantify. Top-down theories are a lot harder to quantify, which means they're a lot harder to measure, which means they're a lot harder to do. So we have a lot less information about that. We do think that one of the things that could be going on is the visual system is taking statistics about our world, okay? It's taking both, again, the statistics of our past, and it's taking the statistics of our current visual information and combining those two probabilities together unconsciously to kind of guess ahead about what's happening in the current visual field, in the current retinal image. So again, it's combining the idea of this prior probability, and it's the prior probability of all possible scenes, okay? And so in the image here that we talked about earlier on in the chapter, that was referenced earlier in the chapter, B and C are both possibilities for A. There's lots of different possibilities for A, but B and C are two of the many possibilities. And what your visual system is unconsciously doing, the theory says, is combining all of those. It's also taking information on the for each possible scene, the probability that produced the current retinal image. So in this example, B is more probable than C is, because we have continuity for the rope on the left, where we don't have continuity for the line on the right. So that's going to make it more probable that the image, what's happening with the ropes under that fallen tree, is B rather than C. But again, we're taking both of those things and making simultaneous judgments about this. So it's again the idea that we not only are processing this information from sensation up to perception, but we're also taking our knowledge and our experience, and we're using that information to meet in the middle and make judgments about situations like this. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.